That's one small step for man.
I have a dream.
We fight for peace.
Hi, I'm Kate Kelly. Welcome to American Snapshots from America Comes Alive. This story that I'm going to tell you today is about a 1909 cross-country car race. Now, if people today were to hear that in 2015 there was going to be a cross-country car race, what would we do? We'd groan, we'd pull out our phones, and we'd check the route. As long as it wasn't any place near where we were going to be, fine, let them race across the country. But if it were going to be near where we were going to be, we would worry about traffic, backups, closed roads, added security, and of course all those onlookers. There would be the local people who came out to see the race, but there would also be those onlookers who would travel along with the racers to see the progress that was going to be made. In general, people today would feel like it was a really bad idea. What about 1909? Would people feel differently then? Well, yes, I think they would if they heard about it. You've got to remember that at that time, all news was local. The idea that there was a radio or a television evening newscast where they would hear about something that was happening across the country is very unlikely. Also, few people had cars. So if they did hear about it, it would be like, oh, well, that's interesting. However, if they happened to be in the town where the cars were coming through, it would actually be a really exciting moment. You'd call your friends and neighbors to come with you, and you'd go down and you'd see those automobiles. So the attitude was very different at that time. But of course, then and now, you always needed one thing in order to stage something like that, and that is someone with deep pockets. And in 1909, there was a fellow like that. Mining heir Robert Guggenheim had just come back from the 1907 Peking, China to Paris race, and he had won it driving a car called the Itala. He comes back to the United States and he figures what would be more fun than to stage that kind of race here in the United States. So he starts exploring the idea with people, and he mentions it to car manufacturers. Car manufacturers think that's a wonderful idea. If people see the cars can go from one part of the country all the way into the other part of the country, this might encourage people to buy them. So they thought this was wonderful. In 1908, he announces that the race is going to start in New York City's Times Square, where else, go across the country and end in Seattle, where they were going to be having the Alaska Pacific Yukon Exposition. So ending right there at the fairgrounds would be a great place for publicity and for concluding the race. So the announcement goes out. But as always, there are wrinkles in any good plan. An astonishing 324 people had been killed. This was sounding very dangerous to the public. And the car manufacturers pulled back on this race and they said, we can't participate in this. People will think we're promoting danger. Well, Guggenheim was a man with a mission, and he reorients a little bit, and he comes up with the idea of calling it the 1909 Endurance Contest. The manufacturers think, well, that might be a little bit more acceptable, and Guggenheim takes it a step further. He clarifies what the rules will be. The rules will be very specific, and east of the Mississippi, cars will not be permitted to drive faster than 14 miles an hour. Now, west of the Mississippi, they'll be able to really break loose, and they can drive as fast as 18.8 miles an hour. So that part of the plan was set. They also had a rule that any car that entered had to have every single part stamped. And the parts that the cars started out with needed to be the same parts they concluded the race with. Nothing could be switched out. So it's a go. But at June 1st, 1909, not very many entrants showed up. Guggenheim had hoped for 30. They had 5 cars there. The first car was an Acme. It was a chain-driven car. It was made by a company that had formerly made bicycles. The second car was the Itala. The third car was a car we haven't heard much about because it doesn't exist anymore. It was called the Shawmut Roundabout. And this was a luxury car, and people thought these were grand. But the manufacturing plant in Massachusetts had actually burned down, and only 2 cars had been saved. One of them was still sitting up in Massachusetts, but one of them had been sent to participate in this race. And the manufacturers were feeling like, well, if we could win this race, maybe we'll have enough money and publicity that we can keep the company going. So they had a lot riding on this. But they had two more competitors coming in, and that was Henry Ford and his two Model T Fords that he was entering. They had just been introduced in 1908, so it was a brand new car, and as far as Ford was concerned, it was a perfect opportunity to let people know about this new $850 automobile, and he really wanted to win. Now, he also wanted to win so badly that he really thought through this contest, and one of the things he knew was the car needed to be light. So he stripped it down, and it was essential. There was no windshield, there was no rear seat. It was essentially a front seat on wheels, and that was it. But it made a very light car, and that had its advantages, certainly. So the cars take off, and they're on their way, and as they go through, they do begin to run into obstacles. Now, one of the first obstacles they run into is something we wouldn't think of today, but there weren't enough bridges going across rivers. So if you were lucky, you would be the first car to arrive at a river. The ferry boat would take you across. But if you were the second or the third car and you came and the ferry was already on the other side, what were you going to do? This was a competitive race, despite what they were calling it. Well, some of the drivers took to a very dangerous process. They would go up to a railroad trestle, look across to see if there was a train coming, and if there was no train coming, they would race their car across the railroad trestle. Not a good idea, but there were no collisions, fortunately. So certainly rivers and bridges were a problem. The other thing was the roads were really bumpy. They weren't paved. They were like going over a washboard. So those poor men must have really been jounced around for, a period of time while they were making their way across. Now, the third thing they ran into was that there were no maps. Most of the United States at this point had not been mapped. So any maps that did exist were sketchy, where there were question marks as to exactly where certain roads went. And there were very few road signs, so you had nothing to guide you as you were going across the route. But Ford had a plan on a couple of these things. He had set up a network of Ford dealers across the United States, and this gave his team an additional advantage. They didn't have to travel with a mechanic. The other cars were traveling with a driver, a relief driver, and a mechanic, so that was 3 men, and Ford had only 2. His men, he could get his cars repaired by the dealers, and the dealers could also give them tips as to what direction the locals would tell you to take to stay on the particular road you were heading on. So that was another advantage he gave his drivers, and it was definitely something that paid off. But in the meantime, the other final thing, and this was something everybody had to deal with, was there weren't any gas stations in those days. So what you had to do was fill up whatever tank you had on your car and then travel with gasoline in some sort of a container so that you could refill on the road. Then you'd get to another gas station perhaps, or a general store, buy more gasoline, and go traveling along with whatever you could buy. So there were many, many problems along the way. But the cars are doing okay, they're making pretty good time, and they get as far as Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the Atala conks out. So now we're down to 4 competitors, but we're getting pretty close to the west. So the cars are steaming across, heading toward Washington and going into Seattle, they hope. And the Model T that's leading the way is in the Cascade Mountains and gets stuck in 4 feet of snow. Now, Ford is down in Seattle and hears about this disaster, and he must have felt they were so close that he just had to go up. He drives up from Seattle, helps them dig out the car, and they are able to come into Seattle, and they finish the race first and in plenty of time. Now, the next car to come through is the Shawmut, followed by the Acme, and then finally the other Model T. So the cars have actually all completed it except for the Atala, whom we lost early. The Model T was first, but when the Shawmut drivers come in, they have a question about this. They put in an inquiry. They say something happened to that first Model T, and we would like to have this investigated. So the contest organizers know when they've been had and that they probably better do the right thing. They halt any sort of declaration of a winner, and they say, okay, we will investigate. Like all investigations, it takes a while, and 5 months later, they come back with the news. The Shawmut was indeed the winner. The Model T had its engine switched out by one of the dealers, so it had been in direct violation of the rules. The honor had to go to the Shawmut. But you have to remember, this was Henry Ford. 17 hours before that Shawmut had even looked at the outside of Seattle, that Model T had crossed the finish line, and the next thing you know, Ford had gotten out front of the whole thing with his marketing campaign. The $850 car that won the New York to Seattle endurance contest. He was out there with everything. The publicity was all over that the Model T had come in first, so no matter what the ultimate decision had been, Ford made the best of it. In the meantime, that was a very good thing for that Model T. It doubled the sales of the Model T that year. They sold 19,000 cars. The following year, the number also doubled, and by 1916, they were selling 50% of all the cars being sold in the world. So I would say that this endurance contest actually was the car that brought the Model T and cars in general to the masses. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's one small step for man.
We fight